Queens of Afrobeat is the culmination of a decade of research. First book that looks at the lives of women in Fela Kuti's work, and you would know Fela Kuti, both of you at least, as one of Nigeria's most prolific and controversial musicians of the 20th century, right? And little has been written about the role that women played in the formation of Afrobeat music. And so what the book does is to chart that history from the early 1970s when the women began showing up on the scene up until when Fela died in 1997, and basically track the afterlives of their role and their work for decades in Fela's work. On the one hand, it's a fascinating story to tell. And on the other hand, it's the most vivid illustration of how women walk within those margins, right? It's how do you claim autonomy?
In this episode, we speak with Dotun Ayobade. He is an assistant professor in the Performance Studies and Black Studies at Northwestern University. And we welcome Dotun. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, nice having you here with us.
Yeah. I want to ask you about your research. And I know that you have a very interesting work going on. And I also know that you are working with Afrobeat, and you have this very interesting title, Queens of Afrobeat. Can you tell us what is going on with that research and what extent you intend to go, and what you are looking to achieving as a teacher of performance studies and Black studies, and how you connect it back to the continent?
So many questions.
Yeah, those are good questions. I'll try to pick them in layers.
Yeah.
So Queens of Afrobeat is the culmination of a decade of research. It began as my doctoral thesis or my doctoral dissertation, but it's now going to be out in a few days now as the book. And it's the first book that looks at the lives of women in Fela Kuti's work, and you would know Fela Kuti, both of you at least, as one of Nigeria's most prolific and controversial musicians of the 20th century, right? And little has been written about the role that women played in the formation of Afrobeat music. And so what the book does is to chart that history from the early 1970s when the women began showing up on the scene up until when Fela dies in 1997, and basically track the afterlives of their role and their work for decades in Fela's work. And one of the challenges that I seek to pose to the reader and to interlocutors on this project is what it means to recalibrate that history. Like, how would that history look different if we paid attention to the lives and stories and perspectives of those women, right, who are not the kind of iconic male revolutionary figure that gets taken up within and outside of Nigeria? Like, how does that history then shift if we spoke about it or if we mapped it from the stories and struggles and triumphs of those women who are now long forgotten, pretty much? And part of my project is to seek to kind of recalibrate what the focus is, or recalibrate who's at the center of that storytelling. And it's also an auspicious moment, in my perspective, to be writing about African popular music and African popular culture, because over the last decade or so, there's been a surge of interest in Afrobeats. This is Afrobeats with the S, which is electronically synthesized music. So we could think about the Burna Boys and Davidos and Biancas and Sarkodie's in that category. But there's been a surge of interest, and I think it's genuine interest and perhaps fascination or surprise, right? But I feel like there's not enough kind of conceptual tools for understanding how and why we got here, or how and why African popular culture seems to have seized the world's attention. So this book, one could think about it on that as as a contribution to that conversation, to say, well, this is one way you could chat historically how we got here. Of course, there are multiple genealogies one could map, but this is potentially one of them, right? If we kind of recalibrate the stories from the lives of women, how does that reshape how we think about popular cultural production in the moment? So that's my kind of broad spiel on what the project does and what contribution it seeks to make.
Thank you very much. While you were speaking, I was wondering why Afrobeats, Why Afrobeats? Or why Afrobeat? Because of, the time or the genre that you are referencing more in your book. I think about the high life music movement that I would say was trending at that time as well, right?
When you say that time, what you mean the last decade?
Yes, like
in the 70s? Is that?
Yes, in the 70s.
Oh, absolutely.
In the
Absolutely,
70s, in the time of, people like Osadebe the first and the second,
Rex Lawson,
Victor Waifo.
Victor
yes,
Waifo,
absolutely.
And a lot of the times men are more prominent in these stories. And so, that's making me wonder the women that were in those circles and behind those movements as well. And but why Afrobeat amongst all of these other, musical movements that happen in West Africa?
Okay, that's a great question, actually. Afrobeat, because it's the most fraught. It's also the most vivid example of how women walk within the margins of popular cultural production, right? And so if you look across the board, and this is the case I make in the book, you look across the board, all of these bands had some form, most of them, right? There were specific bands like, say, Sunny Ade's band, just think self-consciously all men in the band. And you had some Fuji Juju bands that had just men in the bands. But even within those kind of formations, right, women were still present, right? Whether these women were family members, sisters, aunts, or significant others, maybe lovers or girlfriends who were playing important sacrificial roles in sustaining those bands. So even in those spaces where you have an all men formation, like there was the question of women's presence and women's emotional sacrificial labor was just behind the curtain, and you just had to look hard enough to see it. In the case of Afrobeat, what you do have is one of the most prominent examples of women being at the forefront. And when I say forefront, I mean in the bands, I mean on stage, but also in everyday life, right? Of all of the kind of musical formations that we had in the 1970s, most of them had women. But none of them had women in the same way that Fela's band did. And the critical difference was the ways that Fela blurred the boundaries between home, the private and the public, between the home and the band. Also the kind of controversies that dogged the women's participation in his band, right? And typically you would have in many of these other bands, and maybe Segun Buckner would be a close one, or what's his name?
Fatai Rolling Dollar.
No, there was even someone closer to Fela Kuti. I have the name on top of my head in terms of style.
Oh.
So it's maybe someone like Segun Buckner is the closest. So these artists had women in their
Is
band.
it Dede? Sorry to cut you in.
Dede work with
Mabiaku,
Fela Kuti.
yeah,
Yes,
Dede
Dede work with
Mabiaku.
Fela Kuti, but I'm talking about competing bands in terms of style.
Okay.
I wouldn't know.
So these bands had women, and they would probably have 3 or 4 women in their bands. Apart from those bands, we had nightclubs where women would show up that had women on kind of periphery of their kind of...
Like the Africa Shrine?
At the Africa Shrine, but also I'm saying nightclubs outside of the Africa Shrine, right? Where they might have a dancer who gets paid per night, but that kind of dances to live music, but she's not integrated in the band in any meaningful way. So you had bands like that, and you had nightclubs like that where women played roles as dancers, as low-waged dancers. What's different in Afrobeat is the ways that a commune becomes the infrastructure beneath the production of the music. Okay. Right? A commune of young women and men, many of them, some of them, school dropouts, what we call school dropouts, like left school to come and join the commune and then became integrated into that kind of musical family in that kind of way. And this was a very controversial social formation in the 1970s. Like it wasn't a common thing for young women who should be in school,
yes.
and girls, right? And this is where it gets the question of legacy and entanglement of Fela Kuti and women becomes particularly more intricate. Is that you had young women and you had girls. So there was a controversy, a whole moral controversy that dogged Afrobeat music in the 1970s. And court cases, right, where Fela was in and out of court because of, for a number of reasons, but one of them was being taken to court for child abduction, because that was the only law in the book at the time. So on the one hand, it's a fascinating story to tell. On the other hand, it's the most vivid illustration of how women walk within those margins, right? It's, how do you claim autonomy in a space controlled by men? And how do you claim autonomy in a space where the scope of your creativity is circumscribed by a male band leader, but also by the market, right? By what is ostensibly demanded by the market.
Yeah.
And this particular group of women, I think, are fascinating examples of how they kind of shape-shifted within those margins.
Thank you so much. I feel like exactly what the book is about is what this takes my attention to, which is there's like things going on and we miss that when we focus so much on the person of Fela in looking at that time and all of his accomplishments and not seeing, these women playing these roles and like how that happened. Now, before I ask my other question, I would like a quick answer for this one.
Okay. Is that yes or no question?
Is it yes or no?
Okay.
Well, it's a one-word answer. Though.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just one.
I'm terrible at those.
I think it's a one-word answer. In your research and in your writing, are you writing questions or are you writing answers?
That's not a one word. That's not a one word.
Like, are you writing problems or are you writing solutions?
I think I'm writing both at different points in the book. I know this is not the answer. This is not the answer you wanted a one word
all right.
answer. But I think the closest is both. And I don't know that there is any way to do one or the other. I think I leave on the note of questions at the end of the book. And the question I leave on, the note on which I leave at the end of the book is what to do with failure. Right? So after charting this kind of long history where I talk about the emergence, the controversies, the major events, the minor events, the kind of political circumstances that gave birth to this particular unique musical form, the particular formations that gave birth to Afrobeat as a social experiment. It's like we do all of that and we get to, I think, chapter 7 or 6 when Fela dies, right? And that's an inflection point when these women have to deal with a different set of questions about their lives and their mortality and their inheritance and the nature of their entanglement with this artist who's now gone. And it's a different set of questions they have to ask, right? So that's one of the kind of somber moments in the book. And so I leave on the note of failure, which is what sense do we make of failure? And how do we think about failure if we were to think about them as having failed in this experiment? What's the political use of failure for us?
I like how you put it. What is the political use of failures? Because use makes me think of the word value. It makes me think of purpose. It makes me optimistic that, the history and the story of these women and of that musical society and that time can inform, today, and maybe teach us new ways to imagine curating or organizing musical groups or even performance arts, and how women are involved, right? But my question came up because in today, or as of today, men are still the gatekeepers in the musical world. Men are still the gatekeepers. They don't have to sit in front of something to be like, yeah, I'm the one. But think of every musical group that is thriving, that is not led by a man. Kelly. You didn't expect that, right? But yeah, Kelly is in the music business and she would know. But let's think of any musical group that is thriving, that is not led by a man. I feel like it would be very few. I know of bands that are like men and women owned, but when I think of, like, for example, in Nigeria, one of the top musical groups, so 2 or 3, Chocolate City or Maven Records or Maven Records, or there's another one that's skipping my mind right now, but most of them are led by men. And there are women now, in the front lines of this musical groups who are doing amazing things. Yeah, Afrobeat has now sort of evolved, if people would allow, to Afrobeat, in its own way. It has its own new life, its own contemporary dynamic. And why I was asking that question earlier is to see how that past and the stories of, women who were in this industry early on can influence and current trends in a more like optimistic way. So what would be your view on that?
So when I spoke with one of the queens, the woman that worked with Fela Kuti, this was in 2013 or 14. When she made was a long interview, and then during that interview she made this person reference to where we started it. She said we started this movement. This was before Afrobeats had even made this kind of global splash, right? He said we started it, and kind of laying claim to themselves as pioneers, albeit forgotten pioneers. Like we started it, and I was around that time that Wizkid. So whenever Wizkid sung that song Jaye Jaye, that was this kind of one of the songs that were on the radio at the time. Yes. So one could think about it as a specific reference to those kinds of moments when artists are drawing a fairly clear link between Afrobeat and Afrobeats, between Fela Kuti and themselves, but also just this proliferation of the makeup aesthetics in certain Afrobeats songs. So one could think about that comment as a reference or critique to this practice. But also one could think about the ways in which we could learn important lessons from the lives of those women to make sense of the struggles of contemporary Afrobeats musicians, not just Afrobeats, just women in the public space, right? Women seeking to deploy their craft or exercise their creativity in a public way, whether that creativity involves the use of voice, whether it involves a particular way of deploying their body in the public space, that there is a lot of lessons that we could learn from what the queens had to endure and how they navigated those pressures with how contemporary artists, women artists, are having to deal with those same pressures, right? And example, we could think about multiple examples, one of them being Tiwa Savage and the ways that she's had to kind of contort herself, kind of navigates the scrutiny of her life, her choices, her so you see those continuities, right? And when I see someone like Tiwa Savage, I think about the Lijadu sisters from the 70s who had to wrestle to be recognized as legitimate and talented artists. And they were also very forthright about the misogyny in the industry. So I think there are important lessons that we could learn from going back, right? Going back and saying, it's sobering to see that in 2024, we are still having to deal with those kind of persistent issues. But I feel like there might be, there's valuable lesson to learn.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I don't hate men, leading or anything like that. I think, they're doing the hard work. Maybe I want to believe that it's just hard work.
Nope.
But it's just, I think we are, perpetuating certain, certain styles or ways that things are being done in the industry, because the stage has now moved from the shrine or like just, a concert stage to YouTube, to Spotify and all these other, and Vimeo or Vivo and all these other channels, to Instagram. The women are still doing those same things they did on the stage. They are doing them in these videos and they're doing them behind the scenes, and men are still like at the forefront of it.
But personally, I feel like, and this is my own opinion,
Yeah.
I feel like we should change ourselves by minimizing the opportunities for all kinds of artists to
express themselves. Yeah.
Right? I think as a society, we do ourselves a great disservice by imposing certain limits. And if we look at the industry, even with Afrobeats as it is right now, I feel like some of the artists who are pushing the envelope in terms of sound, in terms of kind of proposing a different way of listening, are women. I do. Who kind of experiment with sound or kind of ask you to kind of listen differently.
Like alternative.
Maybe not, we might not even classify it as straightforward Afrobeats, but the kinds of experimentation you see happening within the spaces where kind of folks are pushing, oftentimes are women. And it leaves me wondering, what happens if we simply just let these artists be? How much richer would our kind of cultural offerings be? How much more dynamic would it be? How much more wonderful would it be?
Yeah.
So I don't think it's hard work.
That's so
Got you.
so much, knowledge and so much information from you, and I'm happy you came here. But before we let you go, I want you to tell us where we can find your book, if it's available, and how we can get it.
So the full title of the book is Queens of Afrobeat, Women, Play, and Fela Kuti's Music Rebellion. It's coming out with Indiana University on June 25th.
Are they in the shops now?
It's available for pre-order. So you can order it now, but you would have to wait until June 25th for it to get shipped to you. But it's available, and I think the ebook is also available. I prefer the hard thing. And if you're like me and you want the hard thing, just
I'm like you.
So
analog.
It's on Amazon. It's on Amazon. It's on bookshop.org. It's on Barnes and Nobles. But you wouldn't get it until the end of June.
Thank you so much.
Yes.